So it needs to come under your hair, right? So you can lift your hair up for me.
No wonder you need 5 or 10 minutes to do this.
Sorry, just tell me to do something.
No, it's all right.
And then am I okay to put that down the back of your dress?
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Rob, hi. Yvonne. Oh, all right, thank you. How are you? Good, and you?
Northern agenda, no?
Yes.
You're
You're chairing it, aren't you?
I'm chairing today.
Are you?
This one and the last one.
Oh, really?
One in the afternoon.
everyone. Hello. It's me again, Rob Parsons, Northern Editor for Reach. Hello and welcome to the breakout session addressing a topic of massive importance for not just the North but the country as a whole. Are people going back to public transport, and what more needs to be done to ensure that they do? You okay for the mic? A little health and safety announcement first. Face masks are optional and hand sanitizer can be found throughout the venue. And in the event of a fire, please exit through the corridor to the new Station Street foyer where you entered the conference. So I think we'd all agree that one of the biggest challenges to come out of the pandemic is encouraging people back onto public transport. The past 18 months has undone much of the efforts in moving people towards public transport, and with car numbers reaching pre-pandemic levels in some areas, rail in particular is still some way behind despite the leisure trips being on the increase. Now, apologies for another plug for my newsletter, but in today's Northern Agenda, Tracy Brabin, as she was saying earlier, is very frustrated by the extent to which people are just getting back in their cars. The level's actually increased since pre-pandemic, and not embracing public transport in the way many of us would hope. In the interests of journalistic integrity, I took the bus in from Chapel Allerton, where I live, into the city centre today. I was hoping for a tale of woe to regale you with, because it would have made more interesting copy, but actually the journey was great. The bus turned up on time, everyone was wearing masks, and it arrived in the city centre very promptly. But the overall trend is there to see. So we've got some great speakers today to get to the bottom of this issue, so let me introduce them now. First is Andrew Jones. Andrew's been Conservative MP for Harrogate and Knaresborough since 2010 and came into politics after working in sales and marketing for Betty's and Taylor's of Harrogate. He served as a Transport Minister and is the chair of the Transport Across the North All-Party Parliamentary Group. David Hogarth is Strategic Rail Director for Transport for the North and has extensive experience in rail strategy, services and projects, having previously been Director of Development for West Yorkshire Combined Authority and the lead on rail strategy. Yvonne Fox-Burnby is Stakeholder Manager for Transport Focus, the independent watchdog for transport users, which puts the interests of transport users first and aims to get the best deal for passengers and road users. It uses evidence-based campaigning and research to ensure it knows what is happening on the ground. Now, it wouldn't be an event in 2021 if we didn't have to also go to someone on Teams, have a hybrid conference. So we've got Meryl van den Boomen, who is Marketing Strategy Director for the Rail Delivery Group, joining us on Teams. Rail Delivery Group is the British rail industry membership body that brings together passenger and freight rail companies, Network Rail and HS2. She's been responsible for the UK rail industry's national marketing recovering strategy across media, PR and promotions. So a lot of interesting speakers to have their say today. Shall we hear first from Andrew Jones, MP for Harrogate?
Well, morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks, Rob, for that introduction. It's very good to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about getting people back onto public transport. And I think we need to be clear, first of all, that it is really important we get people back onto public transport. I know when we all received the advice from clinicians that we had to avoid it, to stay safe, it was part of that broader package of how we would tackle the pandemic. But it was also a reversal of all that those of us who've been in transport for many years have been arguing. Get out of our vehicles and get onto public transport. So it was a complete about turn. And we should remember that the reasons that we were making those points haven't changed. We need to make sure that we make progress on important societal issues, carbon emissions, air quality, cutting congestion. These were the arguments that we were making, encouraging people to leave their cars behind. Well, those arguments haven't gone away. They still need tackling. Arguably, they are more critical than ever. Climate change will dominate much of the news agenda over the months ahead because we're only a few weeks away now from COP26. That will be a huge national priority. Air quality was rising up the agenda before the pandemic hit. It's a huge issue for cities. Where we are in Leeds, this would be at the heart of a clean air zone, but it's very hard to deliver a clean air zone unless you have good public transport. Good bus networks, I think, are at the heart of thriving city economies. Well, they might not have been in the news agenda over the past few months, but it will certainly be back in the months ahead. And I would like to add one more significant reason to getting people back onto transport, and that is money. Now, the government has bailed out large sections of the economy during the pandemic, transport obviously included. But I don't think we should assume that that will continue. We mustn't expect it to continue ad infinitum. The government has spent over £400 billion on direct COVID support. It faces increasing costs, particularly in the world of healthcare, as we are dealing with catch-up. But it also has taken in less revenue from depressed economic activity. So what does that mean? Well, basically, any organisation, and the government has got about north of £500 billion less than it thought it would have only 2 years ago. Any organisation facing that kind of budget change cannot pretend it is business as usual. I've been a transport minister, as Rob said. I've also been a treasury minister. I can imagine some of the conversations which are taking place between transport and treasury, having been involved in this. Treasury ministers will be busy saying right now, well, look at all the pressures that we're under. Why am I giving a large amount of budget to the Department for Transport to move air around the country? If I was a transport minister, I'd be busy saying, well, it's very hard to make predictions right now. Look at the pandemic, how the way it's shifted. We don't know how this is going to settle. And the services are absolutely critical to our national objectives. So for a variety of reasons, cutting congestion, economic growth, carbon, air quality and money, we need to get people back onto public transport. And I have to say, I think people are doing that. I think the data is showing that. I've been using public transport throughout the pandemic, going down to Parliament, and I know it's changed because I'm not by myself anymore. I was having an entire Zuma train and then a 24 bus to myself. It feels totally different. The data shows it. So we're seeing growth, we're moving in the right direction. I think the question is, what can we do to accelerate that growth? I think the first thing is to emphasise safety. That is, safe to be back on public transport. There are many people in our communities who are hesitant, even though we've all had the all clear to go back onto public transport and resume much of our old lives. They are still self-denying because of caution and safety. So we need to emphasise that it is safe to be back on there. Equally, at the other end of the spectrum almost, we've got people very keen to resume their old lives. And there is pent-up demand. Perhaps, as Rob said, it's to do with leisure services, but it isn't just that. People are keen to get back and talk to other people again. It's nice not to be doing a conference over Zoom, I can tell you. Whether it's just people going off to the football. I went down to Westminster last Sunday evening, not yesterday, the one before, and shared the train down with a bunch of Leeds fans who'd just been watching an unsuccessful match at Elland Road. But the point is, people are getting back going. There is demand. We need to capitalise upon it. But the fact that we've got two groups there with quite different attitudes show just how split things are as we recover. We also have to recognise that back-to-work patterns are changing, and we do not know what they will be as they settle. I think that means it's very, very difficult indeed to plan in public transport. What I suggest that means in terms of marketing is that we need to make sure we have good, flexible products to help people back onto public transport with whatever their situation may be. We also need to recognise that we have new products and new services. So I think part of what we need to do is keep emphasising that public transport solves their problems. Be very positive about it. We're clearly getting into a period where there will be some major capital announcements over the course of the next few months. We have a budget next month. I think capital will be under significantly less pressure than revenue. So I think part of what we need to do is have a strong voice for the North, making sure that we get a good share of it. It's really all about positive messages which mutually reinforce our point that transport is an essential part of building back, making sure we don't just recover, but we actually do it better than before. A harmonious, virtuous circle, I think, will be absolutely critical. But if we don't make the progress that I think we need, we will miss our carbon emissions targets. We will struggle to deliver the air quality objectives. So this is absolutely fundamental to broader societal progress. I'm extremely optimistic, I have to say. I think we will see things settle. I think we will see a government which is backing, I'm not part of the government now, but I think we will see a government which is going to be backing a levelling up agenda at the heart of what they're doing. That presents us with an opportunity, not just getting people back onto public transport, but making sure that as we see that happen, the North benefits very strongly from the investment. So thank you for the opportunity to come and say a few words. Look forward to answering questions a bit later.
Thank you, Andrew. So let's hear from our next speaker, who is David Hargrave, the Strategic Rail Director for Transport for the North. David.
Thanks, Rob, and morning, everyone. So I think this is quite a pivotal moment for this rail recovery in the North for a number of reasons. I think particularly because we've had investment in new trains over the last few years, actually on the back of strong arguments put forward by northern leaders, and that's all started to come through now. It just really struck me coming into the station this morning and over the last couple of weeks, how much calmer it feels than the commute before the pandemic, but also how busy it is, relatively speaking. It's getting busier, but also that sense of actually something has changed here. That looking around me, I could see all the new trains, new or refurbished trains in a way that just wasn't visible before the pandemic. So I think we've got something there. We've got the recovery to grow on the back of, and of course we've got the change coming in the industry through the white paper as well. So all the ingredients are there. We need to look at the markets out there very, very closely. The good thing about the North is we were at the leading edge of growth just before the pandemic. Despite all the problems back to May 2018 and through 2019, we actually had a really strong growth approaching 10% just before the pandemic. And then we've been at the leading edge of the growth back. So there's now about 80% of passengers that were travelling before the pandemic. But of course, it's a different mix. One of the big surprises really, or is it a surprise, but one of the big growth areas has been leisure travel. The reason perhaps it isn't a surprise is because we've got so many great venues and destinations across the north of England, and there's always been such a mix of travel across the north. It isn't just about commuters. It's definitely not just about white-collar commuters who can trade the office easily for home working. It's also about blue-collar workers, manual workers, and leisure travellers. So that's actually a strength, that we've got such a diverse range of passengers across the north. So we've seen the traditional peaks go and flatten really. So how do we actually tailor services to those new markets? And we actually had quite a lot of experience of that during the pandemic. So one of the big things in the pandemic was us working with northern authorities and the train operators, Network Rail, to look at what services were needed at any given point, whether that was catering for the Nightingale hospitals as they were developed, or key workers during the height of the lockdowns. And that came about through local knowledge, strong partnership, and what was really responsive rail industry at the time. Hopefully we can capture that and build on it as we drive up that growth. So the markets are going to be different. So leisure travel in particular is going to be much, much more of a market to tap into. We've seen that growth. We've actually seen more than 100% of normal going back to 2019 leisure travel, and significantly more on some summer weekends, some of our coastal resorts. And that's really great to see. But we know that's an untapped area of the market. We know that leisure travel can be difficult for families, in particular from a price point of view or just from a convenience point of view when it's competing with a private car. So how can we develop new products, new markets to appeal for those sort of customers? And even with commuters, we know that from our strategic transport plan, something like only 1% mode share across the board for rail. So there's a massive potential to go at more car drivers and more mode shift. And it's never really been possible to market the morning peak properly before, because we had old trains, we had lots of crowding problems, and to market that product was quite difficult. As I said, the product is now different. There is space available in the peak for those people who do commute, but obviously people are travelling at different times, so it's a different sort of market. So working with operators to market the product better, to look at ticketing, of course, as well, because that's a big barrier, and we'd like to see pay-as-you-go ticketing develop further and rolled out, and that's something that we've been working with operators and local authorities. Can we tap into the bus strategy work that is going on there as well, and actually join things up? So one of the things we can offer is being a multimodal authority with a multimodal transport plan. We think we can be a really strong partner, not only to the existing rail industry, but to Great British Railways as that transition comes through going forward. So we think we're a natural partner. We think the work we've done during the pandemic has demonstrated what we can do working together. We want to capture that ability to respond quickly and work collaboratively. So we've been in dialogue with the transition team and with Network Rail about what we could bring in the future. And actually, I think it comes down to two things: collaboration, working collectively, and consensus, to try and come to a view that is right for the North and is right for the new markets. By bringing in your voices of our local authority partners and leaders, we can get this product right, and we can actually develop something that's going to be fit for the future. So am I optimistic? Well, I'm generally always quite optimistic, but I think particularly we are seeing passengers come back, that's for sure. There's a better product out there. We've got new markets to go at. There's substantial markets that if we get the marketing, the product right, we can really attract people over. We're ready to partner with GB Railways in the North, who are a ready-made partner. So I'm pretty confident that we can lead the recovery in the North and actually start a bit of a rail renaissance as well. So look forward to talking through some of those in a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Lots of positive thoughts there. So our next speaker is Yvonne Fox-Burnby, who is the Stakeholder Manager for Transport Focus. Yvonne, come up.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Really good to be here. Thank you for having me. So we've explained what Transport Focus does. We're the independent watchdog for transport users. We've been surveying over the last 18 months 2,000 people weekly about the current travel behaviour and attitudes to travel in future, to gauge what their attitudes would be like, and we're continuing to do that over the coming months. There's been a couple of things that have stuck out that people have valued, and one of those has been the enhanced cleaning programme that was introduced by operators. And the other one was continuing to look at how best to use technology. So the introduction of technology to manage expectations on how busy services are. People have really valued that. On Friday, we released our latest omnibus survey. And people said there was a third of people, and I've been tracking this and it seems to be in a trend, but a third of people are still saying they don't feel that they will ever feel comfortable being on public transport again. So there's an untapped market there. There are people who have lapsed. And we also released a social distancing report on Friday, and that broadly reinforced what we knew already. There's a wish for operators not to rush back to normal. We're entering a period now where people are expecting to travel more through commuting patterns. It's been mentioned already. But face masks and face coverings are the key safety measure people are relying on to help them feel safe. And this is influenced by other areas as well. So I've got a friend whose son is in school and they are still mandating the use of wearing face masks. This impacts and influences people. It makes them nervous. You know, if schools are still doing it, is it still a bit scary out there? So I think this is also reflecting in falling levels of satisfactions on face coverings and social distancing since June on both bus and rail. And if you do a trawl of Twitter, which I'm sure some of you will probably do quite often, you only have to see the appeals to operators to get face coverings, make sure everyone's wearing them. There's still a nervousness about it. I think people they understand about social distancing, that it's a little less cut and dried, that it's a bit trickier to manage. But operators can mitigate against that by using those technological advances, so telling you which services are busier. And I think having conversations with colleagues, it's clear that people are definitely in two camps. We're still at very different stages of returning to normal. So you've got people who are double jabbed, very happy to get on public transport, and then you've got others who are noticing that people aren't wearing face coverings and not social distancing, and it's making them really reluctant to get onto buses and trains. It will take a long time for people to readjust. It doesn't just happen overnight. You've got people who've been travelling throughout the pandemic who have few concerns, but you know, it's not out of the news yet, it's not moved down the agenda. So once that starts to happen, I think more people will feel more confident. I think one of the ways in which operators and the industry can really help is to maintain those COVID-19 measures and communications that have worked so well throughout the last 18 months. Don't take your foot off the gas just yet. People still need that reassurance, and reassurance was the big key word from all of our research. People need that. If there's information and guidance about face coverings, get it out there, let people know. But it's also talking about the product as well and making sure the product's right for people. People's habits have changed now, so frequency of services, people feeling safe. Ventilation is another word. We never thought we'd say that before the pandemic. We were quite happy with, or were we happy? I don't know, but our satisfaction levels now dictate that we expect services to have this, to have ventilation, to feel safe. And I think we mustn't forget that there's two main reasons people choose public transport: cost and convenience. And we need to get the basics right. All it takes really is one positive experience to start reintroducing those habits if you've got a lapsed user. And then obviously the decarbonisation agenda, that also has to be taken into account with, along with climate change. So all these things we will be looking at to make sure that the product is right for passengers. That's it. I look forward to discussing it later. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Yvonne. That was great. Now, finally, joining us via Teams today, we've got Meryl van den Boomen, who is the Marketing Strategy Director for the Rail Delivery Group.
Thanks, Rob, for the introduction, and thanks to the other panelists for the great introduction. Thank you. Apologies for not being there in person. It's a bit funny because I can't see any of you, but I'm hoping you can
I think
see
you're on
me.
mute, Meryl.
No, I'm not. I'm not on mute.
We can hear you, just very quiet. I think they'll take...
Mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Rob, for the introduction, and thanks for the other panelists for your interesting intros. I can hear myself double. Is that something you can do something about?
We can only hear you once, but I'm sure
Well, I'll just go ahead and see it.
they're working on it.
It's a bit funny. I can't see any of you, but I'm hoping you can see me. Let's go back to the start of the pandemic. Have a total overview of what happened. So obviously, you know, the revenue dropped really significantly at the start. We went to 5% of the pre-pandemic revenue. And as the pandemic started, we also started working on this recovery strategy
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. That's good. Did you like it?
Yeah.
Yes. So we have live with campaign, and as I said previously, it's a collaboration between all the Department of Transport folks and the DfT themselves, which has been a very interesting but fun collaboration to make something really, really big. As you saw, when you saw the campaign, it is an emotive campaign about bringing people back to the moments that they value the most and connecting the things that they love the most. So the people, the places, the memories of what life was about and what most brought them joy. The campaign is going really well. This is the 5th week that we're in right now, and we see good results. So what we can see is that we have a big recall, which means that a lot of people recognize seeing the campaign. The recall is around 60% right now, and in that group of people who recognize seeing the campaign, you can see a significant difference between people who are positive towards Riddle, and you can see a significant difference to people who bought a ticket for Riddle, which is just great. And then you can see that the two goals of this campaign, positivity, bringing positivity and trust towards Riddle, and making people to buy a ticket, are getting very, very well. So that is a good intermediate summary of what we are doing at the moment. As Andrew pointed out in his introduction, marketing is a tool to change demand. As there is a big market to change right now, as people are not really sure on getting on the trains, the national marketing campaign is really something to change that. But as Andrew also pointed out, there are parts that we can't influence at the moment, and that's mainly business and commuter, as the offices have to ask their people back first before they really start to think about rail as a modal option again. So in summary, I think if we look at what we are doing right now with the total industry, I think the national marketing campaign really helps with bringing positivity towards rail and getting people back in the trains again. But the flexible propositions and the new retail experience need to come in place to get people really, really over the line. Of course, in the background, we need a reliable and accessible service to really make people happy and to make sure that people are coming back again to the railways. And the green argument is obviously something that is really, really on top of our minds right now, especially going to the COP. I think it's good to underline that as well in our marketing strategy. And that's something that we are working on at the moment as well. Thank you for now, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mel. That was great. So we've got 15 minutes now for a quick Q&A with these guys, and then we'll open it up to the floor for any questions that you want to ask before we go to lunch. I'll start with a general one. The word I picked up from both Andrew and from David was optimistic. You're both feeling optimistic about where things are going in terms of people's return to public transport. So I'll ask this to all of you. I mean, how optimistic are you, and why are you optimistic that public transport will return to not just the pre-pandemic levels, but to the levels that they need to be to achieve the various policy goals that we want? I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. What makes you optimistic?
Would you go first?
Yes, please.
Right. Well, I think simply because we have better products, and those better products give a better offer to the consumer. So that's one reason. And what does that actually look like in practice? Well, we have a new fleet of trains on Transpennine, new and refurbished trains on Northern, new trains on LNER. This is a position that we haven't had in the north of England for decades. So we're seeing enhanced services, more of them as well. So, for example, North Yorkshire County Council have delivered, working with Network Rail, the enhancement between Knaresborough and York, which will double the frequency of trains on that service. This is a very good development. So my point is really that we're at the start of where people can see how things have changed and changed much for the better. That's looking at rail. I think the same thing can be said as well about buses. We're seeing a change with the national bus strategy, how different areas are going to choose a model of operation for them. I would anticipate most areas will choose an enhanced partnership model as they use the different options available to them from the Bus Services Act of 2017. So I think positive in that sense, better products. But then I think people will also be thinking, okay, how are we actually going to make sure that we are a better, stronger, more resilient society? And I think they will be thinking about their footprint in the world. The most motivating issue, judging by my inbox, is progress on environmental change. And we can't do that unless we think about what we do ourselves, and as a part of that, we have public transport. So I'm optimistic in a broader societal way, but also because we have got a better offer for people.
Yeah, absolutely. David?
Yeah, not to repeat that, which I do agree with. I'll probably say I'm optimistic because we're seeing the ability of the industry to respond in new ways and be flexible, and that's something we've seen throughout the pandemic and is really, really important. I think very often in the past the rail industry has been quite inflexible, difficult to deal with. So I think that's why I'm seeing the optimism on that side. I think you perhaps draw a slight distinction between the longer term. So I think we will be at the leading edge of the recovery, but as Andrew and others said, there's a big gap in terms of the amount of subsidy going into the north. So we actually need sustained investment and growth. And we could get choked off if we don't have that pipeline of investment that's been mentioned earlier. So we actually need to look longer term, not just to the recovery, because even when we get to 100%, we won't necessarily have the revenue in the same mix that we had before in terms of the commuters and leisure traffic. So we need to look longer term as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yvonne, you were talking earlier about this recent survey Transport Focus did. A third of people still not comfortable to get back on public transport. With that being the case, do you feel optimistic that we're going to get back to the levels that we need to be?
I do. I think that there is clearly a demand. We're up to 70-75% of bus services now, pre-pandemic levels. We've seen the return on rail, more on the leisure side, but it's looking at the product now, because people have choices now. You know, we've got some work coming out in the near future where we've asked people about returning to work, and I think there's a lot of people who are expecting to return to work by the end of this year, but it's not going to be 5 days a week anymore. It's going to be 2 days a week, so the product has to be suitable. There has been a lot of good things that have happened over the last 18 months. Punctuality and reliability have been, I think, a lot better. So it's holding on to those values, but getting the right product, because people will weigh up whether it's worth, if their services are only running an hourly or 2 hourly, is it worth me spending £25 to go into work, or should I just stay at home? So for those of us who will have a choice to have that blended working, the product has to suit them.
Yeah, absolutely. Emil, we were hearing about the work you were doing on the marketing campaign to get people back onto rail. Obviously, a few months down the line from that, are you confident that things are moving in the right direction in terms of people returning to the railways?
Yes, definitely. And if you look at the data, you can see that, again, like, we're now at 62% of pre-COVID levels in terms of revenue, but leisure is now at 93%. But as one of the other journalists pointed out already, after the holidays, we were at 104%, which basically means that people are ready to get back. And apart from what the businesses are doing, and if people go back to the offices for 2 weeks, and 2 days a week, or 3 days, or 4 days, because I think we're not sure yet what the behavior of people will be in the future. I think they are ready, and you can see that in the numbers from over the bank holiday weekend. So I'm really, really positive, and especially because we in the industry learn to work together more now, and all the 9 customer meetings in the week to point that out, that we think more about the customer, and we should be enhancing that in whatever way that comes to frame.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the pandemic has changed so much, and I think one of the ongoing debates is the extent to which the pandemic has meant that big infrastructure projects, your HS2s, your normal powerhouse rails, things like that, are less of a priority than they were. And there's a whole variety of reasons why, which I guess we'll hear in the integrated rail plan about what's going on with those. But I mean, we've been talking about buses, been talking about regular commuter trains. But in terms of these big transport schemes that attract a lot of attention, has the pandemic weakened, do you think, the argument for those going ahead? Should we be concentrating, as I think the National Infrastructure Commission said, on the sort of more regular local commuter services that get people from A to B, rather than these big projects? Perhaps I'll start with you again, Andrew.
I hope that we do not see any compromise on our desire for big investment in our infrastructure. I think if you take a pace back, we haven't built a railway line until HS2, a railway line north of London since the reign of Queen Victoria in this country. We haven't had a road investment programme since the 1970s. We haven't built a runway in the southeast of England since the passenger jet was invented. We have failed spectacularly to invest enough in our infrastructure. This has meant it is now too expensive and too difficult to move people and goods around the country. So I do not support the argument that we need to abandon longer-term infrastructure investment. I think we must do that. I can see where the Infrastructure Commission were coming from. I think actually one of the best things that we could do to connect people to jobs is bus networks. And I hope we will see a full engagement from local authorities up and down the country to sort out bus improvement plans for their areas. They've had the capacity to do this for a while, by the way, because the Bus Services Act was passed, as I said, in 2017. I was the bus minister at the time. I'm very aware of it. It was just about the last thing that happened in that parliament. But the point is, it's been on the statute book for a while, and it hasn't been grasped as an opportunity. We can do that, and we should do that. But in no way should we say it is one or the other. We need local growth, but that is a more immediate short-term question, and we need long-term investment to tackle the longer-term challenges. So it's an and, not an or.
Thank you. David, I know TfN has been at the forefront of calls for, as Andrew says, but we need all these things. We need HS2, we need Northern Powerhouse Rail, and we need the local investment. So is the HS2 NPR, are they still a big part of your thinking in terms of getting people back onto public transport?
Well, it's the transformational change, and as was said earlier on, it's about planning now to deliver that and rearranging, local services so they integrate with Leeds Hub. And I think, the point about the growth is, if we're back, as we're all optimistic, quite quickly to something like 100% of what we had pre-pandemic, the bits of the network that were maxed out, so Leeds Station, can't run all the additional services that were planned in the previous franchises. Manchester Central congestion spot, we're having to look at a compromised timetable to make it run more reliably. So we're actually just sort of playing catch up here. So that investment is still needed. It needs to be in a long-term pipeline. Not everything can be delivered or afforded overnight. But the point is about having a plan. And actually, by the way, there's room for other investment by other modes. I think it's great to hear about the Sturton Park and Ride, bus-based park and ride site open in Leeds. That's totally complementary to anything that happens on rail, and has been delivered relatively quickly. So again, not afraid to kind of say, rail should focus on where it can really get the biggest bang for the buck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yvonne, the people who contribute to your surveys, your members, do they think, or do you think that these big projects are going to make a difference to bringing them back to public transport?
I think from a transport focus point of view and the people we speak to, any investment in infrastructure is going to mean better services for people. So we would welcome that. But it's making sure that any building of future transport fits around the needs of the people. And bearing in mind that people's needs may change, we're yet to see what that will definitely look like. But yeah, I think it is welcome, certainly.
Absolutely. And Mabel, I suspect I know the answer to this, but the rail delivery group, you still think HS2 and the big projects sort of connecting different parts of the country, they have a part to play in getting people back onto public transport?
Yeah, 100%. The customer needs and the customer dissatisfiers to marketing. I think today, for example,
Well, I think we might go to take a few questions from the audience now. I'm hoping to see a sea of hands wanting to ask questions. Okay, chap at the back, what would you like to ask?
Okay, I've got the mic here, so I'll hold the mic, keep hold of it just for COVID reasons. Please be aware of that. Meryl, you can get a drink of water from the kitchen, but if any of the panel want to get a drink of water for this question session, please feel free. I know you might have dry mouths, so it's all on the table for you, so do help yourself. Right, first question, please.
Well, I've got two questions actually for the ladies and gentlemen on the panel. The first question is regarding the buses, actually. I'm particularly interested in the role of the passenger transport authorities across the north of England, like South Yorkshire Transport Authority or West Yorkshire, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm from Barnsley in South Yorkshire, it's probably now in South Yorkshire. And to most people, it's confusing. The PTE run the bus stations, but they don't run the buses. The PTA run the railway stations, but not the trains. But if there's a failure in the bus services, could not the PTEs run the buses temporarily? And I finish on this point, ladies and gentlemen, the franchises for the trains. That's even more confusing. But there are plans or there are suggestions that when the franchise fails and is surrendered back to the government, could not there be a role for cooperative models to run rail franchises or indeed buses? Thank you.
Who would like to have a go?
I think we should both have a go.
Yeah.
I'm happy to have a go at this. I don't think people are over-worried about who runs what, and I don't think it's particularly confusing. I think that passengers are more anxious about public transport meeting their individual needs rather than who owns and runs a bus station. I, quite frankly, couldn't care less about it. What I want is a good bus. In terms of rail, again, I'm not entirely sure that it matters too much about the franchising. If you look at the rail usage since franchising started, we've gone up by over 1 billion passenger journeys a year. It's gone from 750 million passenger journeys a year to 1.8 billion, obviously pre-pandemic. If it was that confusing, we wouldn't have seen passenger numbers more than double. When we saw bus deregulation, which was probably mid-90s, certainly well before I was involved in politics, I think it was mid-90s, we'd seen bus usage decline at 2% per year for the 3 decades up to deregulation. Bus usage continued to decline, but it declined at 0.2%. So I think the idea that this has been too complicated is just simply not borne out by the facts. I would prefer we just keep it focused upon a good, competitive customer offer. If there isn't a good customer offer, people will not leave their vehicles behind and use public transport. So at the heart of what we do, we should be focused upon customers. So we'll broadly go on that. David?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got a PTE here, but I do have sort of background there, and we work very closely with the PTEs and all the local authorities. And I know what they want is to develop integrated networks. So the branding is the same. It's presented as one network. It won't be run by the same operator, and that doesn't matter. It's the plumbing behind the scenes, and they've got experience in doing that. And we can work with them and GB Railways to make sure that the rail part is plugged into that. So I agree with the sentiment. It needs to be as seamless as possible. There are improvements that can be made, and I hope the new structure of the industry will allow that. Franchises are really no more anyway, because operators on a different form of contract now, where the revenue risk is currently taken by the government, and that does provide more opportunities. We've seen much stronger collaboration with the train operators since the changes in the north, which is good, because they haven't got the same sort of focus on the business plan and finances that the old franchising system didn't work, and I think there was an undue focus on that part of the business model rather than customers. So we've got an opportunity now. Cooperatives, maybe, you mentioned that specifically. I think these new forms of contract and ownership, I think our position is that's something we'd like to be a decision in the north in the future for how these contracts are let and managed, and I'm sure there is room for different sort of models there.
Either Yvonne or Mel want to come in on this one. Does the structure of how our rail system runs, does that matter? And Julie? Yeah, Yvonne.
Yeah, well, I won't go into the whole political side of it, but I will echo what has been said already, that customers really care about whether a bus and train runs on time, and whether it's clean and safe. There are another couple of aspects now that people want to see. I think that these are important messages, and that's what really matters to people. They don't really care who owns it or who runs it. But that's a personal perspective. I think that we welcome, you know, some kind of management on the railway now. So let's see what happens there. But in terms of what passengers want, they want good services, reliable and punctual.
And Meryl, what's your view on the structure issue? Oh, I think you're on mute again.
Yes, definitely. I can't add anything to that. I think that's right. I think the base needs of customers are just a reliable service, and we need to make sure that it's more accessible, and accessible only in the literal accessible way, but also in a very easy to buy and use experience. And as long as we do that, it's not really an issue for customers. What is owned by who? But saying that, I think it's obvious that we didn't really make a success out of it in the past. So the new transformation plans are just very, very welcome, and I'm looking forward to that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meryl. Does anyone else have a question? Chap in the middle there.
Do the panellists believe that the removal of face mask mandates has helped or hindered the return to public transport, and particularly the return in people's confidence in using public transport?
Why don't we go to Yvonne first
Yeah.
for that one, as you've already said a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a decrease since June of satisfaction levels on both bus and train. People are feeling less confident, and as I said earlier on, I think that we're entering a bit of a tricky period now where people are adjusting, they're travelling a bit more, and you've definitely got two camps of people, and it will take time to readjust. So it's a very personal perspective, isn't it, face masks, because you know you might feel perfectly comfortable on a bus or a train not wearing one, but the person next to you might feel quite nervous, and it might put them off travelling if everybody else isn't wearing one. So I think that operators can maybe firm up legislation or guidance within their organisations and get that communication out there. I think that's where it really lies. It lies in communicating with the passengers to let them know what's happening. But yeah, we have seen a decrease in satisfaction levels.
Thank you, Yvonne. Anyone else want to come in on this one?
Well, maybe just to say that I think it's sort of simplicity and lack of confusion is what people on rail want. There's enough to sort of contend with ticketing and so on. So the more that message can be simplified, the better. I mean, I did note that people who are passengers are much more satisfied with things like the travelling environment and the safety, etc., their view of safety than non-passengers. So it may be more of an issue with attracting passengers back than existing passengers. Because certainly my experience has been, yes, there's been quite a few people without face coverings on the train, but also the ones I've been on haven't been particularly busy, and it's actually no different to the sort of experience you get in a bar or a shop. So we shouldn't sort of make public transport to be too much of a sort of special case, because it is just reflecting what's happening everywhere in society.
Can I just add to that?
Yes,
That our statistics show that I think 2 in 5 people feel as comfortable now travelling on public transport as they did pre-pandemic, and a further 1 or more in 5 think they will do within 6 months, and that reiterates what I said before about people being slow to move. So it's definitely those people who aren't travelling at the moment who are more nervous about it, but it's getting the product right for them, enticing them back and giving them the best experience so that they keep coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Meryl, what's your view on this one?
Yeah, I think it's up to people themselves to decide, and that's the reason why we encourage it as we put a lady wearing a mask in campaign. This is still a very good thing to do, and I think it will take time to see what people really put their behaviour to it. As we all don't know what's going to happen in the coming months, we all have to watch closely what the government
went down from Yorkshire down to London with some commiserating Leeds United fans. I don't know if they were wearing masks or not, but was that an issue for you, or do you know if your constituents are worried about face masks?
Well, I think actually it's been a complicated position, and as we relax a little bit and we are able to resume more of our old lives, I think some people will feel it's fine to go ahead, as I said in my opening remarks as well, but some people feel very nervous still. It's reflective, I think, of society more broadly. But where we're seeing face masks as a condition of travel, such as on the London Underground, I have to say we're seeing very poor compliance. So I'm not entirely sure that the nation is ready to get back into mandation. I think the nation broadly wants to get on with, get going again and get their own lives back.
Yeah. I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. So has anyone else got
Rob, I
anything?
think we've got one down here.
Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Andrew McGuinness, CPT Regional Manager for the North, with the Trade Association for Bus and Coach Operators. 2 quick statements and then 1 question. First of all, I agree, Andrew, with your earlier point in that the retail core, the hospitality industry, leisure, the tourism industry needs effective, viable, safe transport to get people there, and those industries, and operators need a strong economy for people to visit. So it's a common objective between operators and the economy to get people moving again. And then going on to Yvonne's point on reassurance, we as the Trade Association have been working, as you'll be aware, Andrew, with DFT and government all the way through COVID. We've been leading the risk-based case on behalf of the industry. So I can reassure everybody in the room that operators still have the majority of those measures in place, and agree with all of your points earlier, Yvonne. My question was, political messaging sticks. So last year when the Prime Minister and the Transport Secretary were saying it was your civil duty not to use public transport. And again, every time we've heard, particularly in the coach industry, we've heard supportive messaging from government. We've seen bookings in tourism and hospitality rise, and there's been negative messaging for obvious reasons. We've seen that decrease. So messaging really sticks. So what can government do, and what can the collective we in the room, as people that have invested in some way, shape or form in transport, do on that collective messaging to get people back on transport?
Okay. I guess it seems only fair to ask someone who was relatively recently in the government this question. What can government do, and what can we as a society more broadly be doing?
Well, sometimes political messages stick, and sometimes they don't. If it was as simple as politicians say something, or we pass a law or whatever, and then we see huge societal change and everything, well, quite frankly, we'd have a perfect society all around the world, and I think all of us know full well that isn't what happens. So, yes, it certainly did make a big change. You know, I think the nation looked at the advice coming out from the senior clinicians, looked at the advice from the government, knew they were in truly exceptional circumstances, the greatest health crisis in a century, with the most infectious respiratory disease ever. And they knew this was a big moment, and they listened. I don't think they listened that much to politicians, to be perfectly honest. You're very optimistic about that. I think in terms of what should happen, I think consistent messaging that is upbeat and positive. It's not been easy to be consistent, I think, during the current circumstances, because situations have evolved. It's been far easier to get into lockdowns than to get out of them. That's true. I think we've seen that right across the world. But I think consistent, simple, positive messaging with that focus upon the customer, building upon what the gentleman was saying earlier, I think that is right at the heart of how government should be communicating, and that will help all sectors of transport, including your own.
Meryl, I guess messaging is a large part of your role. What's your view on this? What should the government be doing, and what should society be doing?
I can only say that the government worked really, really well together with us on the national marketing campaign. So there are definitely things that the government is doing. And if you look at it on the whole, I think the government is encouraging their lives to act as they are doing in multiple sections. So yeah, I think the government is doing what they
Thank you. Yvonne, what would your organisation like to hear from the government in terms of the messaging? Something simple, is that the way forward?
I think it comes down to what the operators, how the operators interact with customers, really, from our perspective. It's keeping it positive, but also reiterating how safe it is to travel and keeping on with the enhanced measures that have been implemented throughout the pandemic. I think it's not, I've said it before, but it's not taking your foot off the gas right now, keeping on with that messaging and keeping people informed about what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, what's your view on this one?
I think in terms of the government, it's about signalling that they're with us, with the industry, in terms of that long-term investment. So IRP, we talked about that earlier on, but making that signal that it's not just about the short term, we're in it for the long haul in terms of investment would be my suggestion. Then in terms of what we can do, we were, I think, in quite a bad place back in 2018-19 with the rail industry. We had some difficult meeting in this very hotel, actually, just before the pandemic. And actually, it's changed the relationship, as I mentioned, completely. So we're now working with the operators to support their messaging campaigning. We're actually investing some of our own money into that work as well. So a much stronger collaboration. That's what we are doing, and I hope we'll be able to continue that.
Excellent. I reckon if we're quick, we can sneak in one very last question.
Yeah, I think we have one more over here, unless there's any not part of the room. So we'll just take one from this gentleman here, if that's all right, Rob.
Yes,
Thank you.
go ahead, sir.
What are the panel's views on rural residents, bearing in mind such areas as North Yorkshire, very considerable number of scattered communities who are a long way from a bus from a railway station, and indeed increasingly away from bus routes, because an increasing number of bus routes in the county are unsustainable, and local authority budgets are being severely strapped at the present time. How would you view the people who are living in these villages being able to access a social life and shopping and everything else?
That's a really interesting one, isn't it? Well, we know that the rural side of transport is one that perhaps doesn't get quite so much attention. I mean, who'd want to come in on this? What can we do to help rural residents get back onto public transport? Are different policies needed?
I can perhaps give that a go.
Yeah.
I think one of the things with Transport for the North is we represent every part of the North, so it's absolutely the case that the needs of rural areas, we've been doing some work around sort of tourism for some of the more rural areas recently, are at the forefront of our mind. I think for me, key thing is it's back to integration, and I think there's probably something that can be done an awful lot better with technology as well, and more flexibility. So that's whether that's demand responsive buses, linking in with rail services that actually make a proper connection, and then ticketing all on a single app. So I think for me that would be the one of the biggest things we could do.
Andrew, you're in a largely rural constituency, or partly rural. What's your view?
Actually, it's an overwhelmingly not rural constituency. It's 90%, 95% urban constituency. However, this is clearly a very important question, and I think it's right to be asked because it can be overlooked, and it mustn't be overlooked. I think the key really is, as David has suggested, this is about integration. I think integration between bus routes which will be commercially viable and those which require further social support. And those haven't been very integrated. But I think the opportunity through the enhanced partnerships will allow that to happen. And then David's point about things being demand responsive and technology integrating are absolutely spot on. I think that's where this goes. We are at the beginning of a journey to change how rural transport will work. And I'm glad you raised that question, David, because I think it's a very important one.
Excellent. Anyone else would like to chip in on this one?
Only to say that as Transport Focus, we work closely with PTEs, local authorities and operators, especially with bus timetables, and because we recognise it is an issue. So we're very much at the forefront of discussions with that, and making sure people aren't isolated. We know it's an issue, and it goes back to some of the points about if services are only 2 hourly or 3 hourly sometimes in some areas, it isolates those people. So we very much know it's an issue.
Thank you. And Meryl, a final contribution from you?
Yeah, as I can see in many talk strategies and also trends, I realize connectors at the center, door-to-door and delivery as a service are very well on the heart of that. So I think it's very, very important point to stress and it's definitely on the agenda.
Fantastic. Well, it's been a great discussion. I've had a lot of food for thought there. I mean, just to sum up briefly, I think we all know the reasons why we need to get people back on public transport. I won't go into them, but I think what I've been hearing, there's a lot of reasons to feel optimistic in terms of the numbers and what's in the future, but there's also quite a lot of uncertainty and barriers still to overcome, as lots of people still not feeling confident about going on public transport. There are already better products for the consumer, new trains, more services, and I think it's encouraging that people want to make a change for societal and environmental reasons, but still, as we've been hearing in this session and the previous session, we've got that big gap in terms of investment in the north that needs to be overcome, and we need that consistent stream of funding. That's one of the things that will really help. So that brings us to an end of this session. I'll just have a quick housekeeping announcement, which is that we're now breaking for lunch for 60 minutes, and there will be a podcast recording in the Queen's Ballroom, which you're free to watch while eating your lunch. Please could you make your way to the restaurant to get your lunch, exit the room to the doors on the right-hand side at the back of the room, and go down the stairs through the doors to the restaurant. So let's give all our speakers a round of applause. Oh, those doors. Good.
And I'm on the 12:45.
Excellent. You need to dash. Thanks, Andrew. Nice to speak to you. Nice to see you. That was good.
there's no struggle there.
You sit this end, right there, because your chair is.
Are we okay? Can everybody hear me? Hello, welcome. I'm Nancy Fielder, editor of The Star in Sheffield. First of all, if you want to wear your face mask, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. I feel you had all this morning. There's hand sanitizers around the room, and if there's a fire, we're going to leave the way we came in and through the entrance where you came into the building, if that's all right. And there's plenty of people who will show us the way. So I'm going to ask our panel to just very, very briefly introduce themselves, and we'll start with Miranda on the end, if that's okay, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Miranda Barker. I'm the Chief Executive of East Lancashire Chamber of Commerce, so a very heavy manufacturing area. I'm also the co-chair of the Chambers nationally on their environmental and low carbon group, and elect director locally in Lancashire.
Good afternoon. I'm Elaine Seagrove. I'm the Programme Director from the recently formed Great British Railways Transition Team. Thank you.
And I'm Henry Mears, and I'm Director of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Molyneux, and I'm the Roads Director at Transport for the North.
Thank you very much. So we're looking at the pipeline. And as a mother of 3, that means to me, what are we actually creating? What are we leaving? And what do our kids, what do people, maybe younger than me, not that there's anybody younger than me, things might be coming? And actually, what are we doing for that? And there's a couple of things I've had in recent weeks that have maybe surprised me, because when you see things through kids' eyes, it's different, isn't it? So my son, who is 15, took himself and his friends on a day trip to London in the summer holidays. First text, Mom, the transport's free. It's not free in Sheffield, I can assure you. It's not free anywhere where we live. And he was a little bit surprised by this, and he couldn't understand it. And to be honest, I couldn't give him a good explanation. Secondly, my daughter has just graduated from University of Manchester. Now, as you will all know, it is possibly the most beautiful drive in the country from Sheffield to Manchester across Snake Pass. It's gorgeous. But should that really be the main route linking 2 of the biggest cities in the country? It's completely bonkers. I think sometimes when you step back and you look at actually how difficult transport in the north is and the challenges facing us, it makes us think slightly different about the pipeline. I'm optimistic we can do things, but I think there is a lot of work ahead. And when it's children raising these issues, I think we've got to take it very seriously, which is why it's fantastic that we're all here and we are looking at what we can do to make a difference. So it's quite a big question, this one, about the pipeline and what we should do. Are you okay to start?
Yes, I will. So I'll start with a Japanese proverb, which is, a vision without a plan is a daydream, and a plan without a vision is a nightmare. And that was very much at the fore when in 2019, Transport for the North launched a strategic transport plan, because it was a vision, but it also had a plan with it about what schemes we wanted to introduce. But not only that, it was the schemes that we wanted to introduce over 30 years. It was that long-term pipeline covering road and rail, and at the time integrated and smart ticketing, about how we can transform the North by putting the customer at the heart of what we wanted to do. So, as Martin said earlier on, for those of you who heard him, the so what? Well, the so what was actually 850,000 extra jobs above what would have been created and £100 billion worth of economic activity. And one of the things that we identified was that the North is 25% less productive than the rest of the country, and one of the main reasons for that is poor connectivity, particularly east-west. Most of the investment in this country has been sort of north-south to get people to and from London. So what we did was we worked with the 20 civic leaders across the North and the 11 LEP chairs, and they bought into this plan and this vision about how we were going to transform the North. And the key thing to remember about transport, it is a network. And the way we've always approached transport investments in the North has always been piecemeal. I want this junction improvement versus this rail improvement. And then there's a bidding war for the kind of things. And that's really not doing much in terms of transformation. So at the moment, we came up with this network. We're updating this, this investment program, making sure that we can still deliver things on time. But more importantly, what we're trying to do is get over the wider benefits such as decarbonisation, well-being, how we can link better to jobs and skills as we start to move forward. And the reason that a pipeline is important is that it takes so long to do. So 10 years is not unusual for you from the moment that you've actually decided to do something before you get it built. And in this world, the world changes so much as we go forward. And that's why it's important that we have a pipeline of schemes that have been developed to a point whereby when they actually become credible, we can then actually implement them. And the way I like to describe this is the jigsaw analogy. So what the Transport for the North did was they gave us the picture on the front of the jigsaw box of what the network could look like so that we could describe to people how it will affect their lives. But not only that, we got all the pieces in the jigsaw box and actually said how to put the jigsaw together, the pieces in the right order to make the maximum benefits as we came by. And I think that analogy is important in getting people's hearts and minds as to why we need to invest. The other thing as well is that our evidence base will enable the key politicians and other decision makers to actually come up with a more compelling argument for investment. Because we are in a competitive world, we're hearing signs from Treasury about, the credit card might be maxed out. How is the North and Michael Gove in his new role, how are we going to make sure that we're in the best position to bid for this particular funding as we go forward? As Martin said earlier on, we've done a lot of work on future travel scenarios because it's pointless coming up with something and saying that's it for the next 30 years, that's what we want to do. So we've built in the agility through our future travel scenarios against different scenarios of what investments are required as the world changes, as people's travel behaviours changes, as we move forward. We're supporting it with a decarbonisation strategy and the freight strategy, but key to it all is making sure that people can move forward. And what we want to be able to do is start to describe that those children who are starting secondary school now, what is the transport going to be available to when you finish your A-levels, when you finish your degree, when you come out and you will start looking for a job? Well, also, I think subnational transport bodies work better because sometimes tackling things at the national level is a bit like trying to boil the ocean. What we have is a network here in the North of people who are a coalition of the willing who actually want to make a difference. So we're doing some work ahead of the government on what would be the EV, electric vehicle infrastructure required to make sure we do that. We're looking at urban and rural. We're making sure that it's part of a multimodal process as we go forward. Because what we do know from our visitor economy report, which has been produced, is that actually the visitor economy is very, very important to the North. And at the moment, most people travel some of our national parks, and they all do it by car, which is unfortunate, so which is why we need to invest in our rail as we go forward. So the key thing for me is if we can have some greater devolution, enable the powers, and with that money, but more importantly, give the transport leaders across the North and the business leaders of the North the ability to influence and decide what is needed first to transform the North. So that for your children and for our grandchildren and friends' children, that when they come to do it, we put in a network that meets the future requirements as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Henry?
Thanks so much, and it's great, Peter, to hear a bit more about how the kind of transport plan can be made to happen, because it is one of the kind of probably the greatest achievement of Transport for the North. You had the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review, which was led by Sir Richard Leese, then on TfN's board. And then subsequent to that, you had the Strategic Transport Plan. And fundamentally, that lays out the practical steps you have to take to be able to get the types of levels of productivity that, as Peter said, we need for the North of England. And the business community are very supportive of that process because we know that there are real barriers to growing the northern economy. So the constraint on parts of our rail network, some of the issues we've got around some of the pinch points on the road network where you've got particularly heavy areas of congestion, those issues have got to be addressed if we're going to be able to unlock the opportunities that we have in our economy. And particularly those east-west links that Peter mentioned are so key, because the whole point of the economic scenario that the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review pointed out was that there are areas of sort of economic kind of opportunity or potential in the north of England that are not being realised because they're not connected with the other areas in those sectors. And so an example would be in high-value manufacturing, which is obviously very important to Miranda's part of the world. The north of England is actually very good at that, but it's good at that in South Yorkshire, it's good at that in the northeast, and it's good at that in East Lancashire and other parts of Lancashire. Those are three places that are uniquely almost impossible to get to from each other by anything other than road, and even by road it's very difficult. So when we had which predated the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review, for instance, a science innovation audit that looked at Lancashire and South Yorkshire in particular, you were trying to think about how you're going to link those places together in terms of their capacity and their capabilities. But the benefits of doing that from a manufacturing perspective were all constrained by the fact that you wouldn't be able to necessarily realise those benefits. And if you're talking to people in other parts of the world about this being a credible place to invest, what we can't just do is sell South Yorkshire or just Lancashire. What we want to do is be able to sell the north of England as a joined up proposition with particular talent pools and particular innovation strengths. But if all those things are not working together and are not linked together, and you now have an AMRC in Samlesbury, for instance, that's all part of that approach of trying to get the best of the north to be available to the right businesses in the right places. Well, the AMRC, because of transport right, needs to have a physical presence in Lancashire, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be a credible facility to be used by businesses there, because they can't be expected to go to South Yorkshire every day currently, because the network doesn't allow that. And so I think what we would say, I think, is one of the kind of big opportunities is to think about the funding streams in a more joined up way. So at the moment, the government gives Network Rail a pot of money, and it gives a pot of money to whatever they call themselves at Highways
National
England
Highways.
these days. Yeah, they've had a rebrand, haven't they? I still like to call them the old name, but yeah, I know they've got a new name. So they get their big pot of money, maybe not as big as they'd like it to be, but they get a pot of money, and they spend that money entirely without any connection to the other, right? Despite the fact that actually people make journeys between the same places in the north of England, and they choose between transport modes. And so you have people debating that corridor, for instance, from where I live in western North Yorkshire, on the borders of Keighley, across to East Lancashire. And so if Miranda and I ever wanted to see each other, not at a conference, we could potentially meet somewhere there. The debate about how you improve that corridor is had completely in isolation, for instance, in central government, between rail and road. Nobody thinks about the fact that actually that's an underinvested in connection. Well, when they talk about a road improvement or a rail improvement, those things are done pretty much in isolation from each other. And that isn't a sensible way of making policy. And I think what we, as the Northern Powers Partnership, would encourage government to do is to think about how we can fund the interventions we need in a managed and considered way. And that isn't about giving the North an unlimited credit card, actually, to do everything we might want to do, because actually you can't do everything in one go anyway. It's about having a clear programme of activity that gives certainty to investors, both the supply chain within the transport sector, but also those people who are going to rely on that infrastructure to be able to grow their businesses. At the moment, we have very little certainty because you have a control period, and some would say, in the case of the rail industry, it tells you the things you might do in the next control period because it doesn't tend to necessarily get delivered on time, but it's there. But what it isn't is a credible path for understanding what could be done or could be done in different modes. It doesn't have that multimodal element to it. So I think that particularly for Transport for the North and for its role going forwards, government has a real opportunity to help to make more joined up decisions about where we should put our investment. And at the moment, we have to ask for new roads in the north of England, because even if sometimes in some places a road intervention, a rail intervention could be put together, and you said you had one intervention that would give you all the benefits you need, there is no way in public policy currently to make an argument like that. There is no funding stream for projects that replace the need for instance, a new road with a railway. There is a little bit of that thinking around walking and cycling in the highways community, but not enough. And what we want to do, right, is manage the assets. So the highways network of this country is congested, particularly around Manchester. How do we have a grown-up conversation, for instance, around, say, the orbital motorway in Manchester, about how we're going to deal with that challenge? How do we have a sensible conversation about where the investment needs to go? At the moment, Nancy, there isn't a way of doing that. And I think that the obvious point for government is when it comes to levelling up and to how we approach transport. At the moment, we have seen some more devolution of local transport money, but we haven't had any change whatsoever in the way that national funding streams work in the highways and in the rail sectors. That is going to have to change because it is not credible to continue to make decisions in isolation from each other. And I would argue that civil servants, if they want the North to be more responsible, should be allowing the North, for instance, to raise more money. We should be thinking about whatever replaces fuel duty, whatever replaces road car tax. I don't pay either. I've got an electric car. I'm getting to drive on the roads we all use for free. That's not sustainable if more of us choose to do that. We're going to have to find a new way of charging people. I know earlier there was a debate about congestion charging on the sessions. I agree that that's not the right solution in West Yorkshire. But if you were replacing taxes, then hypothecated revenues from a road user charging scheme that would be retained in the north of England to invest in the transport network is a credible solution. It's been advocated by people not just on the left, who've always thought it was a great idea, but in fact, you see people in some of the right-wing think tanks starting to talk about it. I was like, it shows that people who historically were averse to any form of taxation had anything to do with roads in it have realised that it's not credible to let people travel around by car completely for free because it just makes it even less of a real fight for other modes to be able to demonstrate there might be the better way to make a journey if the cost is literally almost close to zero. That isn't a very sensible way to encourage people to make the right choices. So I think that it is about partly raising the money, and I think that those of us who support what Transport for the North are doing, who support the plan, have got to use our ability and the business community's licence to make a strong case for the North to take more responsibility for raising the money we need, not just for spending it. And then it might be easier to convince a perhaps less than giddy Treasury about giving more money to some of our metro mayors and others, that collectively the North of England, if it was going to take more responsibility for raising the money, should then be trusted to spend it as well, Nancy. So thanks again for having me along to colleagues at TFN. Great to be physically with you all, and those of you virtually as well who've chosen to join us that way.
Thank you, Henry. Interestingly, Sheffield is well known for its gridlock, as are many of our cities. It's now officially worse, all the research shows, than it was before lockdown, despite everything we all said in lockdown and despite all the cycle lanes, etc., etc. It's now worse and slower than it was, so we have interesting times. There's a lot to be done. Elaine, can we have your thoughts, please?
Yes, and that's a very interesting point there, Tracy. I was sort of reflecting on that and the way here, where everyone had a sort of taster of what it could be like, a sort of transport planning utopia of people walking, cycling, using public transport, caring about their neighbours and their neighbour's dog and their neighbour's friends and all that. Wouldn't that be lovely? But yeah, as you see, the congestion is back. I live in London and the congestion is horrific again. The air quality is back to the way it was. And we had that taste of what it could be like, and we've opted. So, sorry, I should say why I'm here. I've been asked to lead the development of a long-term strategy for rail. And that's as part of the transition team set up to develop, under Andrew Haynes's direction, the new Great British Railways. So it's a transition team. But one of the immediate tasks that we've been asked to do as part of that, as well as forming the body, is to develop a 30-year plan for the railway. And I completely agree about separating modes. That's unfortunate. I wish I had been asked to develop a long-term transport strategy, but hey, you've got to take your wins where you can. But I'm determined that the strategy should be outcome-focused, so very much looking at what regions are trying to achieve for their regions, that there should be evidence-based, so working very closely with Martin and his team around the great evidence that you guys have been developing to understand what the problems are, what the opportunities are, what's required, and what the goals are. And then my background is in transport strategy development. I'm not a rail expert, so I'll let you know that now. If you're going to talk to me about gauges and all of that, I'm not the person. But what I do know about is about long-term planning, how you can get a goal, a regional goal, get buy-in for that, support, but actually then make sure you focus on that and you get it delivered through decision-making. So I've spent most of my career working in heading up the strategy function, Transport for London. And whilst we've got a lovely long-term strategy, integrated all the modes, all of that, took a wee while to get there. But the key thing is, it's not about the strategy, and you will know that now in Transport for the North. It's about delivering it. It's about making sure you get the pipeline in place, you get the backing, you get the public engagement, you get the support, you make sure that you're talking with one voice, and you get the finances and the plans in place to make it happen. So it has to be an all-encompassing process to deliver what your long-term vision is. So with the plan for the long-term plan for the rail network, which we call the Whole Industry Strategic Plan, WISP in short, it is going to be a challenge because of the fragmented nature of the rail industry, but with the Williams-Shapps plan that's now being implemented, bringing track and train together, a whole new way of doing things for the rail network, whole new culture, a massive shift, a once-in-a-generation opportunity for change. So my little part of it is by taking that long-term vision, but getting that embedded in how we do business and how we engage, so be much more open, transparent, and listening to the regions and understanding what the needs and opportunities are, and then getting the tools in place to make it happen. It's a very exciting time. We've just started our initial conversations, but obviously I'm going to be visiting the north much more frequently, and by travelling around by train, hopefully much more conveniently in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhonda. Hello. Can I just see you? Can we have your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and as Henry says, good to see some people in person, which is really nice. So my first job is to say, Elaine, please come and visit East Lancashire. Unfortunately, I'll have to pick you up from the station because that's 45 minutes from a decent station to get to East Lancashire, and that's exactly the problem. So as Elaine says, I'm not an expert on rail either, but what I am is an expert on our local business needs in the East Lancashire area and what's holding them back. And a lot of those are the same business needs that are holding back a lot of the north of England. So to go back to our title for this section, about the right schemes in the right place and about the right timing, that's what I want to sort of structure my 5 minutes around. So East Lancashire, when I summarise to people what is East Lancashire, I say it runs from British Aerospace just to the east of the M6 across to Rolls-Royce Aero engines just to the west of Yorkshire. And that tells you it's advanced manufacturing, it's strung out over a long stretch, but with very, very poor connectivity to move those goods around the place. They are the goods that will support our economy as we have, I come from Ilkley, so both sides of the Pennines Divide. Awful lot of manufacturing that during the early part of the COVID impact, and we were looking at the economy, what we saw was manufacturing was coming back and supporting the local economies when service wasn't able to. So we need that manufacturing sector to be unfettered, and it is part of the whole of the levelling up argument. So when you look at what do we need, we don't just need to move people around, and we do need good networks to move people around, especially if we want inward investment. If we want people from overseas bringing their factories to us, bringing their businesses to us, they want to look at where they can move their people around. But we also need really good freight movement capacity. And that's why I love the fact that our current funding around transport is looking at the economic argument, because it gives us the ability to build that economic argument and talk about why we need those road schemes, those rail schemes, those integrated transport schemes across the whole of, not just the north of England, the whole of England, the whole of the Great Britain, but especially right at this moment, the north of England, to help us unlock that economic potential. So in terms of place, it does need to be that evidence-linked piece, but also it's about the supply chain that we can build around that. If we create those opportunities in the rail sector, we also have the advanced manufacturers in all of those different areas, whether they're low carbon, whether they're automotive, whether they're aerospace, who can diversify into this rail sector. And I'm going to quote a statistic I hope I get right, but there were I'm looking at Peter, there were 4 big rail manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, weren't there? And 2 of those are up for sale at the moment, aren't they? So we've got a huge opportunity to reposition some of our large businesses and our small business supply chains behind them to work in this sector and actually to support our economy forward from this slightly depressed position into the real opportunities that levelling up could bring. So that's why it needs to be now, to build that supply chain. And it needs to be immediate in terms of that levelling up agenda. It's no good waiting 3 or 4 years. We will have missed the opportunity. We need people like you, Elaine, talking to government and to that giddy treasury, Henry? We have a giddy. I wish we did have a giddy. I've never seen Rishi Sunak look giddy, no. But I would love him to look giddy about the prospect of investing in something which will help the UK lead internationally, so lightweighting and rail, but also really drive that levelling up agenda. So we need the right schemes, economically orientated, in the right place, in the north of England, that's benefiting our supply chains, and we need them now, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Without wanting to appear too much of a cynical journalist, and I feel a lot of us are already rolling our eyes at the 2 words levelling up because we're hearing it a lot, and actually what are we seeing? I'm going to come straight back to Miranda, if that's okay, and say, in all honesty, will a pipeline of investment help level up?
it will be part of that story, because as we've seen with future and past investments, we hope, with the government, it's no good if you make the decision and then you disengage yourself from that process. So look at HS2, look at the previous investments. If we'd first started off with that investment at the time and we'd seen a clear pathway for that investment, and if the Infrastructure Commission had done what we hoped it would in terms of we've made a fundamental investment decision and now we're going to stick with it across party, then that's what the private sector needs to see to be able to then invest in generating those new technologies and put their companies' money into building those technologies. So we need that levelling up agenda, but we need it to be firm, and we need it to be committed to beyond 4.5 years of governmental term. So how long have we got before Boris calls an election now? There's talk of it, is it going to be 23? Is it going to be, we don't know. Is it going to even be 22? Who knows? But will that undo all of these investment plans that we're trying to give them? So we need those firm investment plans so business can get behind it, so the technology development can get behind it, so we can have that pipeline of higher education, innovation, manufacture. But we also need a long-term commitment from government so the pipeline is valid and that businesses don't feel that it's fragile.
Okay. Peter, do you agree? Is this a key thing for levelling up?
I think, A, we've got an evidence base, we've got a really good story, we've got a real good return on value. I think what we need is certainty, and I think we need to be able to then measure the outcomes. If you just take, we had the second Mersey crossing, Ordsall Cord, and the A556 dualled. All in the northwest, all opened within 12 months of each other. No one can tell me what difference it made. Highways England can tell me what road cars go along it, and Network Rail will tell me how many trains go along it. But what we're really poor at measuring is actually the outcomes. And if we were Amazon, they would say, you bought the second Mersey crossing, you bought Ordsall Cord, you bought the A556 dualling, are you interested in this? Because this is the difference it made to your life. You like that, this is what you're doing. And if you take some really good things that are going on, so we've got the announcements about the A66 dualling, but again, because it's Highways England roads, it stops at the A1M. Where actually, if Transport for the North had been around, it would have gone right out to T-Sport, and therefore we would have improved those road and rail links right across the T-Sport. And going back to some historic mistakes, the M65 is great, but it stops at Cone because it got difficult, and that affects the whole of the East Lancashire economic growth. So the whole point is, going back to what I said at the start, is having that plan on that jigsaw box and knowing how the individual pieces, because what government is good at is saying, oh, that piece of the jigsaw doesn't quite fit on its own. But actually, what they're forgetting is the important role in a network, and I keep going back, it is a network. And going back to your point, is people commute less in the north because it takes them longer than it does in the south. So therefore, your opportunities to get a better job, but more importantly, the talent pool for the businesses in the north is significantly reduced. And therefore, by being able to have an hour's commute and covering 40, 50 miles, instead of an hour's commute covering maybe 10 miles, it increases the opportunities both in education, skills, and various other things. And the most important thing for a lot of people in this room is, if we have certainty, it de-risks the program, it makes it cheaper because you can start moving the team that did this job onto the same team that's doing this job. And most importantly, with that certainty, the private sector will then say, I want to invest on the back of it. So I think it's all we want is certainty based on evidence to show that we can transform the north, but most importantly, go back out and tell the residents and businesses about how we've made their lives better.
I've got hundreds of questions. I can keep going, but I'm also very aware that you may have lots of questions. Is there anything at this point that anybody would like? We've got a mic, a roving mic. Would you like to? You were first up.
Okay, I'm going to keep hold of this, so if you remember that. If you just give your name and who you represent, that would be really helpful. And keep your questions fairly short. We can get through quite a few then. Thank you very much indeed. First one.
Thank you. My name is Simon Green from North Lincolnshire Council. I think one of the founding key proponents of Transport for the North. Very keen to pick up on the outcome rather than the output. I've noticed all the conversations so far today is around reliance on government funding. There's been a slight mention this morning on private sector funding. But marrying the alternative funding approaches with a very supportive approach on corridors, which I think Transport for the North have been very pioneering at in terms of measuring transport corridors and multimodal, the cross-referencing and the looking at outcomes rather than outputs. Is there perhaps some way to control timing and certainty of funding or start to look at issuing financial bonds and alternative financial instruments to actually fund corridor development, where there could be a guaranteed uplift, payback, gain share, whatever, over that 25, 30-year period, I think that we've mentioned this afternoon and I think was mentioned this morning. So the point is it time now to look at alternative funding sources so we're not over-reliant just on one government, central government funding with the vagaries and the changing priorities they have, of all colours, going forward? Thank you.
Was it aimed at anybody in particular, or should we just whisk down the line? Go on, Henry.
Yeah, so I think the challenge you've got, isn't it, is you can raise money for any piece of infrastructure you want. You've got to identify a way to then capture the benefits you generate, right? So I think the challenge we've got in the north of England is we don't have the same guaranteed returns in terms of business rates. And you also have a challenge around pooling, right? So on a northern pooling basis, can someone in Whitehaven necessarily see the benefit of something that's done in North Lincolnshire or on the north bank of the Humber? And at the moment, because we're not at the point of 2050 yet, they don't necessarily see the benefit. They might do in the longer term, but they don't now. So in London, the benefit has always been, and I'm sure you'd have interesting reflections on this, so I won't try and kind of paraphrase the kind of experience of TfL and of what was done around Crossrail 2 directly, but I think there aren't the same obvious opportunities, which is why I alluded to it. I think that alternative sources of taxation are a more practical choice rather than forms of development kind of financing based on local drivers, partly because you may want to capture some of that local value to pay for other things, because the challenge about local transport and about national transport schemes and northern transport schemes as a subdivision of those is that often they only have the most benefit when you do them alongside other things. So, for instance, improving transport across the north of England is most beneficial when you improve the last mile and you improve local bus services or you build a local tram. And it's much easier, I think, for local transport infrastructure to do what you're talking about. So if you want to build a tram in a city region, you can absolutely see how you can use developer contributions and different financing models to pay for part of those. I think if a scheme is going to benefit people, and those corridors, some of them do stretch an awfully long way, if it's going to benefit people at each end, some of those corridors go to Scotland, right? How do you draw the definition of the boundaries? And it's why people outside Greater London never paid anything towards Crossrail. There are people, right, who don't live in Greater London who pay nothing, right, towards Crossrail. That local contribution exclusively comes from Greater London, despite the fact that people who live in Greater London are the poorer, collectively, of the people who benefit from that scheme, right? The greatest, most prosperous residents are actually in places outside Greater London, but there just isn't a way of effectively capturing that revenue in such a practical way. And thus, a local contribution actually comes from the place where largely those on lower incomes live, but that's just the only way to do it. And the businesses in that place just have to live with it, right? Because it's largely the businesses who are paying. So I think there are ways of funding infrastructure in different ways, but having thought about it and argued about it with lots of people for a very long time, I'm much more interested in the North raising more money through its own tax base rather than going after those sources, partly because I think the partners to TfN, local government and combined authorities, might have other ideas for the types of tools you're talking about, and I think they're probably more appropriate to use for that sort of scheme or that sort of opportunity than for some of the things we're talking about, which are, in the end, often inherent public goods, which are very hard to genuinely define who the beneficiary was. But I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I think it's a challenge that has meant we as NPP have gone a different way in terms of answering there is limited spending available. What do you do when the jam jar's empty? There are answers, but I'm not sure that's the one I'd go to first.
Elaine, do you want to come?
Yeah, well, I can't really add much to that other than, yeah, in London we've been successful in taking a number of varied approaches, and you mentioned, so for example, the business rate and the community infrastructure levy in the case of Crossrail. That was you know, quite an involved process to get right, and one that would be acceptable to businesses and through the local infrastructure arrangements for through the boroughs. And I I think we had to work really hard to show the benefits that they would gain to be able to raise that. So you would need to have a lot of good, strong evidence to demonstrate that. And I'm not sure if you're there yet, but it's something we could look at, consider.
Are we there yet, Peter?
No, I think it's about building confidence. I mean, you know, let's get some early wins. Let's use government funding to do that. We've still got a delayed decision on the planning white paper. We've got an awful lot of houses to build, and it might be that actually when you're building transport links to a housing, there might be a tangible benefit which you could, you know, follow Simon's route. But I think it's about building confidence. And I think the more we can do it and people can start to see the benefits, then... And also, if you think about it, road, you don't pay at point of use, so it's again, how do you recover that particular point? You know, I was reading an article the other day, and someone was saying that, you know, you're now paying £14,000 for a container where it was £3,000 going, so freight is going up. So it's such a complex financial model. I think it's probably keeping it small and tight where it's achievable, but still building it on a public infrastructure that builds the confidence in everybody.
Miranda, any last thoughts on that?
I would just echo what's just been said. It is about that confidence in a future investment. It's about that commitment and it being seen out long term, and that would enable funding to be levered in. But it is about that security. If we're not sure about that governmental piece of it, then nothing we base on that as the bedrock is reliable. So either way, we need the governmental confidence and security of that investment leading forward.
I think building up the evidence of the impact, Peter was saying, is really, really vital. And all too often that's not done. We put a lot of effort into how we appraise transport investment. We get the money and then just hope that it gives rise to... We should be really checking if we're delivering the benefits that we expected. And if we're not, recognising that and improving upon it going forward. And then that helps give the confidence that Peter was talking about. Yeah. The cause and effect. But we haven't tended to do it. There's not a lot of history of doing that.
Does that fill you with confidence?
Mm. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Gareth Dennis, engineer and writer. I don't want to turn this into a discussion about economics, but essentially that is what it's bottling down to, isn't it, really? So we've had road pricing is not coming anytime soon. I agree that's a good model, but it's not coming anytime soon. So for now, we need to rely on Treasury. For a pipeline to work, we need to kind of bust the idea that national finances are anything like household finances, right? We've already had 2 mentions of the credit card. There's no such credit card. It doesn't max out. That's not how national finances work. So what role can TFN and business and community leaders play in busting that myth? Because if we don't bust that myth, we're not getting that. IPPR have talked about the need for £12 billion more transport spending a year to meet the government's own net zero targets. So how is TFN leading on busting that myth?
I think it's a really good question, and apologies as one of the people who referred to the credit card being maxed out. Maybe I was thinking of my own finances. I think the work that we're doing in terms of our modelling and appraisal. So without getting too technical, basically most transport is the benefits around time saved, which is a very poor, myopic way of viewing the benefits. What we're doing now is the models that we're doing is we have a Northern Highways model, we have a Northern Rail model. We're now pulling them together so that we can actually show the benefits of that. But we're also picking up well-being, decarbonisation, other environmental benefits, jobs, skills, and various other things like that. And I think this is where it depends on the maturity of the government to have a sensible conversation with Treasury, as Henry said, to take these silos of local road transport, national road transport, rail transport, anything else that they want to be, and actually say, look, here's a subnational transport body, and there are now 7 covering the country, and we're now looking at using a common analytical framework. You can now move at scale and pace within those areas, and starting to say, I think the figure before, we were talking about people being obese and various things like that. So how can we take some health money, skills money, all these different funding, and actually feed something in, but actually monitor it in a way that we don't do before, because that then gives you an evergreen fund to actually start saying the benefits that came. So we invested £10 billion, we're seeing 15 billion coming back. That doesn't go off to somewhere else. It actually stays into that evergreen funding to go forward. And I think you're right, it is such a complex issue. But I think there is always going to be demands on government, and politicians have the right to change their mind, but actually what we're after is that sort of certainty. And I see, for me, evidence, monitoring and evaluation, customer satisfaction, some real outcomes, and true governmental spending profiles rather than silo funding, and particularly move away from competitive funding, because local authorities waste fortunes on bidding for things that they might, for no real benefits. So let's have the vision, let's have the plan, let's work with our friends in the private sector and say, okay, if we're going to do this, look at our land use, change the land use to fit where the transport modes are going, and actually let's be adult about how we want to move forward.
Yes, please. Thank you. That's a great question, and it's the one where we all have a part to play in proving that argument. And as Peter just said, and as Elaine said, in terms of not just the strategy, but the implementation and the monitoring and literally the monetary counting, it's if you speak to British Aerospace, who Samlesbury and Wharton, near Preston, and they've got a supply chain around them of 500 SMEs in Lancashire, and you ask them about where do their products stand in international competitiveness, they will say the criticisms that are already levelled at them overseas are that the UK's aerospace product is too expensive and too slow. And a large part of that is towards the transport costs. So if we can then show the benefit in terms of our international competitiveness, in terms of our inward investment draw for some more companies to come and be based in those supply chains, because that's what's drawing those companies in, are those local supply chains, and also in terms of the building of the supply chain to create the infrastructure. And then we have a 3-way inward investment model to show those economic benefits and therefore justify the next round of investment and the next round of investment.
Did either of you want to comment on that particularly?
I was just going to add very quickly that there is the concept, right, that we were going to spend more on infrastructure, but it's currently a concept. We've not really done any of it in practice, and my critique of the Treasury really is that when things have fallen out of that, right, so Crossrail 2 originally was going to happen before Northern Powerhouse Rail. Government's very quick to say we can't afford to do all these things at the same time, but when things have slipped back for reasons that I don't take any joy from, they're very unwilling to see that actually that may have unlocked funding that previously wasn't really going to necessarily be available. So I think the things that do tap out capacity are the current infrastructure sector has lived on feast and famine, and so the evidence and proof points for delivering things on cost or on budget are when you try and do too many things at once, it gets really expensive. And so the Treasury have got very fearful about that, and they don't want to turn all the taps on at once. And I think the challenge is for us is we need to make it clear that the things we're talking about, the individual interventions that make up MPR or parts of HS2, some of the larger road schemes that have already been approved, they're not all going to happen at exactly the same time. So it isn't just about, I mean, credit cards is a phrase that's used a lot, but it's partly around the idea that rather than talking about infrastructure in terms of amounts of money for individual projects, if you actually look at how much you spend in a year across the north on the different modes, it's a much better way of looking at what you're actually spending. So it's not, because actually those are the people, do you mean? So it doesn't matter how long it takes to deliver A66, right? The money will be spent in lumpy bits, right? Because it depends on when they can close it, when they can get the supply chain ready, do you mean when the design work's done, when they're consented, and when they've got designs that are approved, etc. So everything is inherently lumpy, but actually, if you can look at the total amount we want the Treasury to spend, And actually, one of the benefits of more multimodal planning is you can then move money between different projects. Because one of the problems at the moment is TRU has taken more than 10 years, right, to get to somewhere it was supposed to get to a number of years ago. But that money sort of just sat somewhere, didn't get used for anything else, right? And so government sort of committed and recommitted and recommitted, but actually it's only spent that money once. And I think somehow people think they've already spent loads of money in the north of England, and they actually haven't. They've promised they'll spend some money on a few things. Actually, the bulk of TRU still hasn't been spent yet. So it isn't the case that government has spent a fortune already on Northern Transport, now you want more. So actually, if you look at what's actually spent year on year, it's modest sums of money. And what we're talking about, even HS2, is actually relatively modest sums of money on an annual basis. We need to think a lot more in those terms rather than big number, because actually, no one in the Treasury ever writes that cheque. And it's a myth that they do. And I think we need to bust that myth, as well as the credit card, which I think I've also used before. because the Treasury definitely thinks they do have a credit card, and that's the problem. The Treasury use that language themselves to try and portray the idea that resources are scarce, when in reality what we don't have is enough people or businesses able to pay tax to pay back the costs of the crisis. So we're going to have to grow the economy some and become more productive if we're going to pay back the costs of the last 2 years. The north of England has got to play a part in that, and if we don't have the investment, we can't do that.
If we're banning credit cards, I'm sure my children don't even know what checks are, Henry. So I think we need different terminology. Yes, the mic is on its way to you. 1 minute.
Sorry, it's a bit like taking a freight train through the Castlefield corridor. This.
Once an hour in the morning, we'll sell all the commuters.
Matthew Trigg from LNER, London North Eastern Railway, for those who don't take that one. It'd be good to get your commentary on small-scale pipelines. So we manage a range of stations up and down our route, including Wakefield, Wakefield Westgate, which is now the large station of the year as of last week, which is great. But we were able to do lots of small things at the station that improve the user experience, that make modal shift easier. We're consolidating car parking at York and other projects. How do you integrate in the narrative a pipeline of projects at a station or a station precinct level that helps achieve the same outcome with the big ticket items? So we're not just waiting for the Transpennine upgrade, we're not just waiting for Northern House Rail, but people see these experiences like they have at Leeds Station, where there's incremental improvements that make the experience much, much better.
Miranda, she's very keen.
I just had a very short answer, which was about looking at local supply chain, looking at recruiting local apprentices to work in it, make sure that the initial impact of that is felt locally. And then you get that positive uptick towards that investment on the route to the much longer investment journey.
Yeah, and just building on that, I think that's a really good approach, is definitely, and I think you implied it, sharing your good practice. I've had the opportunity to talk to some of your colleagues in NER over the last couple of weeks, and you've really made a huge inroads in understanding your customers much better, from what I understand, and you can see that as a customer on the services. And I'm not just saying that because you're here and you've raised that. I've actually seen some of the research that you've done around that whole customer-led approach, and it's great, and it's bottom up. So we've got to find a way of working with you guys, understanding what your customers need better, and then sharing that best practice and helping join up what, say, other parts of the rail sector is doing. Something I feel passionately too about is also thinking about a customer as having an end-to-end journey, not just when they step on the platform. So how we best work with and get that integrated transport system operators and urban planners and all of that all joined up and talking together. I know we don't have that easily facilitated outside of London, but we know what works well now. We've got plenty of good experience, so just building on the great work that you're doing, sharing the word as you're doing today, and congratulations.
So, sorry, just to come in, I think that's one of the beauties of Transport for the North. So a lot of the contactless was facilitated through us, but I think just the way our governance structure were made up, we're not a separate body. We are 1/20 of all the transport authorities, so therefore the advantage is that it may be West Yorkshire, it may be Greater Manchester, it may be Cumbria, it may be North Yorkshire. They are bidding for their own funds. What we're trying to do is collate that overview of actually, here's 6 stations along a corridor along the line. They've now been improved. That's a much better experience, whereby it would have been 6 individual tales that might have got lost in the story. So I think it's about us being, you know, we're made up of our constituent parts, and therefore we can not only tell the tale of the inter-travel, but actually tell the benefits of that local and how it's then benefited more people as we go forward.
Yes, can we have another question, please? This gentleman there, yeah.
Alan Scarisbrick, Scarisbrick Estates. I work as an independent consultant on development and infrastructure and worked throughout Lancashire, Salford Quays, Trafford Park, Blackburn, and also Mersey Gateway. And like Peter was saying about the importance of measuring outcomes and outputs, and it may not readily, I wouldn't particularly agree with Peter that the outputs, how many cars go over the Mersey Gateway, for instance, you can actually see the benefits that it has made, not just locally to the towns of Runcorn and Widnes, but also regionally, sort of the Port of Liverpool, the likes of Stobart's inland port. And those are things that really can be measured, and even the M65, things like that. So how do you feel with regards to taking that information and putting that into individual projects, manageable projects, to develop the pipeline?
Absolutely. I think if I've not expressed that, it was a frustration that it's not readily available. You know, I think that's where Greater London were far better at saying this is the cumulative effect of what we've done, and telling the population, the business, of what it is that we're doing. Yeah. I think subnational transport bodies and the local transport can tell their own story, but actually use us as a facility to actually tell the wider benefit, because it goes back to that network thing that you're saying. So yeah, it links Runcorn and Widnes, but the benefits are felt probably as, you know, further down than Stoke and as far up as Carlisle. So we need to do that, and I think that's where I'm confident that our new models will be able to show those wider benefits in a way that isn't normally done. You know, and if you think about it, they can build tunnels on the Faroe Islands. They can make a case to do that because of our well-being, and yet we're struggling about very archaic ways of measuring benefits. So I think we can do it, we're just not very good at it. I think it might be the industry. We build it, we move on, build the next one, move on. Any other industry would be saying, look what a fantastic job we've done, and look what it's done for the community, and use that to move on. I think we've just got to get a change in a mindset. And I've been in the industry a long time, and I'm as much as fault as everybody else in telling people what a good job I've done.
Northerners aren't very good at showing off either, so you've got a double whammy there, haven't you?
Yeah.
Anybody else wanted to come in on that? Yeah.
It is important to be able to do exactly that, especially if we're arguing that transport investment is part of the levelling up argument. Because when we speak to our local businesses, yes, you can get an immediate answer of, okay, if we have equivalent pounds per person invested as they do in London, that's levelling up. But when you actually have the conversation and get into it in more depth, what you get is a much longer term answer. It's when the kids have got the same level of aspiration as they have elsewhere. It's when the health statistics are the same as elsewhere. So for instance, someone in East Lancashire has 15 years less economic healthy life than someone in a more affluent area. It's a much longer term thing. So if we're able to show transport investment means that businesses then move into an area, you get in with investment, you get aspiration, you get jobs, you get a better quality of education and kids wanting to buy into it, you get a healthier lifestyle, those kids then live longer. You need to be able to do those much longer term benefits. If we're going to argue that transport investment is levelling up, then we need to be able to look at the whole of the lifetime of that economic benefit from it.
Thank you. Any other questions in the last few minutes? Yeah. This gentleman there.
Tim Calo from Skipton. Our country has extremely ambitious targets on becoming carbon neutral. How on earth do we try and link that both upwards towards the target and downwards to schemes that might get somewhere near making it happen.
Go on, Henry.
So, I mean, there is the decarbonisation plan that Peter talked about earlier. And I think that the challenge, isn't it, is you don't do that by doing nothing. That makes sense. So you're going to have to invest in infrastructure around EV charging. You have to do lots of those things pretty quickly, actually. But you also will still need more capacity. So the challenge is if you simply have lots of congestion, that's not good, particularly when you've still got lots of road freight vehicles on the road. So there isn't a kind of do nothing, sort of like we can all sort of work from home forever in perpetuity type idea. As lovely as that would be, it's not a sensible or sustainable option. You're going to have to build some new infrastructure. And it's a choice between what you build. And I do think one of the current paradigm challenges is that because the North has got an appalling rail network and has been so dependent on its road network, we're in a really difficult position, which is that most of the demand actually is on Peter's area. People want more roads because that's what we've got, that's what we use, that's what's always generated the revenue, right? Ideas like Northern Powerhouse Rail are a bit crazy, really. Do you mean? Because what you're really saying is I want something that I don't currently really benefit from at massive scale because I want to create capacity on my conventional rail network to get things off the road network so that people can drive their EVs around on the roads we've already got, because a lot of the current freight that the highways world looks after, we're better being moved onto a different mode. That's quite a brave argument to make, and I think one of the challenges is, a bit like HS2 was always presented as being about speed, it's really about capacity. MPR was always presented as being about capacity, when actually it's partly about modal shift, really. And you could run lots of more passenger trains across the Pennines if you just told the freight community in the Port of the Humber and the people in Liverpool that they could never get another bit of tonnage across the Pennines. But that's not a sensible thing to say or do. And so in order to get the benefits we need for our whole economy and to get those environmental benefits, we are going to have to do some new stuff. And the challenge comes, how do you do that in a sustainable way? How do you mitigate the impact of new infrastructure? Because new infrastructure itself has a carbon and an environmental cost. And so that balance between building the right interventions and doing them in a way that makes complete sense rather than just following the money. And that is my big fear at the moment, is that central government funding does not mitigate to make the right choices. It encourages local councils and some national transport bodies to follow programmes rather than to actually get the interventions we really need, which sometimes actually might cost less than the ones that government are prepared to fund, because it will require a much more broad multimodal view. And I think rail's a potentially big beneficiary of that, right? Because in the north of England, the natural thing to do, based on current traditional approaches to spending, is to build lots of bypasses, lots of more major roads, potentially some that aren't even in the TfN plan, on particular pinch points. And that isn't the right solution. What we want is to improve connectivity, not build our way out of congestion. And there is a big difference between what's in the TfN plan and a sort of unrestrained approach to road building, which is a very different way of spending infrastructure funding, and it isn't the right thing to do.
Thanks, Henry. I'm going to ask the final question. It's a long one, but it's a very quick answer I'm after. So what are the key challenges, bringing it right back down to the pipeline, for now, for the future, and for the kids long term? Just a quick answer from Miranda, start with you.
I would like government investment to be much more in the way that we would design investment, where you have a decision around people around the table and they make a long-term decision that's going to stick for the good of the UK. So I would like much more cross-party working about long-term infrastructure investment. And it isn't just rail, but let's start with transport investment.
Long-term,
Joined up decision making.
For all three. We're getting one answer for all three. That's okay.
Yeah.
I would agree with that as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, well, they were short answers, weren't they? There you go. Good. We finished on time. Thank you ever so much to our four wonderful panellists. We are back where we started, upstairs. Don't forget to follow the one-way system. If I don't say that, I will get told off. Thank you ever so much for some brilliant questions as well. And thank you to our panel.
Good discussion.
And do come and visit us.
Although,
I would love that.
I'm going to come visit you.
That would be very good.
We've got just the right amount of
You can
questions.
probably find me.
of the USB leads, this switcher, does it stay on the switcher?
It just clip in one of the drawers down there.
Oh.
I'm going to get the lads to decap everything because I keep leaving it together and then I'm hunting around for stuff.
Yeah.
To be fair, that film was meant to go down